I was born with 7 fingers and a couple of spinal issues. This was likely the result of the thalidomide my mother took for nausea during her pregnancy. My loving and beautiful mom suffered from bipolar disease. At one point, she was so low that she sat with my brother, sister, and I in a car on the railroad track waiting for the train to come. Fortunately, she reconsidered just in time. My parents were divorced when I was 3. My father remarried but forgot to tell his new wife that he had 3 children until just after they were married. She was unpleasantly surprised when we showed up on her doorstep after my mother was institutionalized for her illness. Things went downhill from there, and my brother, sister, and I all reached points where we believed that death was a better alternative than the life we were living. My brother, sister, and I survived, but my mother succumbed to bipolar disease and took her life when I was 17. By the early 1990s, I was married to an amazing man, had 3 wonderful children, and a successful dental practice with my husband. I had the feeling that my difficult times were over, and there would be a smooth sailing ahead. I was wrong. My husband was involved in a fatal car accident, leaving 2 boys dead and my husband and son injured. A few months later, I took my daughters, my niece, and my office manager's daughter to California to look at colleges. Near the end of our trip, on a beautifully calm day, Kara drove into a sandbar on the beach in Santa Barbara and broke her neck. I had to call my office manager and tell her that on this trip, where she had entrusted me with the safety of her daughter, I had failed and her precious child was now paralyzed for life. It was the hardest and saddest thing I had ever done. Our office manager blamed me for her daughter's paralysis, and so did I. I was overcome with grief and guilt and shame. My shame and guilt affected our entire dental team. The next few years were difficult, but my family and my office team were recovering, and I thought, once again, that the difficult days were over. I was wrong. In the mid-2000s, our hygienist lost her beautiful hockey-playing high school senior son to suicide shortly after a breakup with his girlfriend, and she lost another child at birth. Our patient care coordinator developed cancer. One of our assistants worked on Monday but died of a heart infection on Wednesday. My brother Mike had a heart attack and died. My nephew Zachary died from suicide. My husband Jim was diagnosed with liver cancer. We sold half of our practice. Then Jim was saved by a liver transplant, and we rejoiced thinking that finally life would settle down. I was wrong. On January 31st, 2009, our world was completely shattered when our son Eric took his life 45 minutes after his girlfriend broke up with him. He was a kind, caring, compassionate, and brilliant engineering student. He was elected to student government, played piano in the jazz band, participated in theater, and made the dean's list his first semester. Eric was on top of the world when he came home for Christmas. 2 weeks later, he was gone. Eric, 19, and Bill, 17, were the victims of suicidal depression, the loss of an important relationship, and a brain not fully developed in the areas of impulse control and crisis management. They were part of our nation's silent epidemic of suicidal depression. When Bill died, I remember wondering after a year or so when Deb would be back to normal. I learned after Eric's death that the answer is never. We are never the same or normal after a catastrophic loss. We are changed. We don't get over it. We get through it. We can never move on. We move forward.
Welcome to Something More Human. I'm Sam.
And I'm Elliot. We're a married couple exploring human connection and its impact on ours, our guests, and our listeners' lives.
Join us in creating something more human. This episode is sponsored by New Mexico Tea Company. Today in the studio / our living room entire apartment, we have Dr. Kimberly Harms. Kim, thank you so much for flying all the way from Minneapolis to be with us.
Well, thank you for having me. I just love your podcast. That's why I'm here.
That was a pretty compelling story, and I think that anyone who listens to it might have a sense of how did you get through that. And so we're definitely going to talk a lot about grief, but I'm curious, there has been so much tragedy in your life. There's been so much loss. But the person sitting across from us right now is very inspiring, very happy, very joyful. And you've talked in previous interviews about the pit of grief and sort of you've been so down in the pit that you started buying curtains for the pit. You were down there. So I'm curious, in those moments before you had the knowledge and the wisdom that you do now about grief, how did you find the inspiration to fight your way out of that pit?
Well, I had an amazing encounter with a cousin of my husband, Jim. Just a couple of months after my son Eric had died, we were in that zombie stage. You know, we were trying to get through the motions. We were at work again, and it was very, very difficult. And I felt that I was going to be in that pit forever. And most people that suffer a catastrophic loss, that's normal. That's what happens. You feel like you're never going to get out. And as I was walking out the door, my husband's cousin came up to me and pointed his finger at me and shook his finger at me and said, "Kim, don't you ever let your remaining children feel that they are not enough." And normally that wouldn't go well if you were to say something like that to someone who was grieving. But I knew his backstory, and his backstory was that he lost his brother at about 19. He had gotten drunk with his friends, and they brought him to the front door of his home and kind of left him there hoping he wasn't going to get into trouble. But I live in Minnesota. It was like -10 at the time, and he froze to death in his car.
Oh my gosh.
Wow.
And his parents never were able to get out of the grief pit. They were in the grief pit. And when that happens, the remaining children feel like they've lost their parents too.
Mm.
And so when he hit me with that, don't ever let your children feel that they're not enough, it just, I was, gobsmacked is a word, the only word I could think of that would describe it. I realized that I had 2 more kids. I had 2 additional children who were suffering as I was. I had a husband who had just had a liver transplant, and he was suffering. And if I allowed grief to consume me, if I didn't fight and kick and scream and do everything I could do to get out of that grief pit, it doesn't happen by itself, then my additional children would suffer. My husband would suffer. And of course, I would still be suffering. So I really became determined at that moment that I was going to fight and do everything I can to get out of that pit. It doesn't happen naturally. Get help. I got some help. It took a long time. I wish I could say you could snap yourself out of it, but you can't. You have to process that grief. It took a long time, but I can now live in the present. I'm here for my 2 daughters. We have a fabulous relationship. I now have 6 grandchildren. Unfortunately, my husband passed away a few years back from, I think, a broken heart. I think after a son died. He did not get treatment. He did not get help for his grief. And I wish he had. He was I call him a stubborn Norwegian. He just thought that was kind of a weakness to admit any psychological illness at all. So he, I really feel that and if you take a look statistically, untreated grief is related to heart disease, stroke, all of those things. And I really believe he suffered physically because he didn't take care of his emotions mentally. And I was able to get the help I needed, and I was able to work through it. My faith is a big part of that. But I really believe that's the difference. And I hope that your listeners who are out there, who are in a pit for whatever, it's a grief pit or a depression pit or whatever, because I've been in many of them, I hope that they realize that they don't have to stay there, that they can work their way out, they can fight their way out, but they have to, they really have to pursue it and get help.
What's interesting is this to me right here, this conversation alone shows the importance of community, because sometimes we don't know how to help ourselves. And you're saying, if I had let the grief consume me, how would that have affected the family around me? And if that family hadn't been there, or if those friends hadn't been there, the grief might have been much easier to stay in. Yes. And so we talk a lot about obviously the importance of community, but sometimes I talk about this with Sam, it's like, if I can't help myself, my primary motivation should be I need to help myself so I can help my wife, so I can help the people around me, not be affected by the grief or the shame or whatever I'm experiencing. So it's really powerful. Yeah.
I think when we think about grief, our mind automatically goes to that sort of like sadness, depression, but also in your story, you talk about feelings of shame and guilt. So I'm wondering if we can go a little bit down to that side of grief and how that experience has been for you, and just kind of unpacking those emotions that are associated with grief and maybe not so common when we think about the experience.
Yes, shame accentuates a grief. It makes it more difficult to get through. And of course, when your mother and your son take their own lives, what do they have in common? It would be me. And so you second guess, you wonder what if, and none of those things is healthy. None of those things is going to help your recovery. I even know when my husband died, he was in hospice. I was taking care of him, and I took his oxygen off for just a second to put his shirt on. He was getting out of a bathtub, which is what we did. That's how you got his shirt on. And he just passed out, stopped breathing. His heart stopped. And he was kind of like that for about 20 minutes. And I actually called hospice. I said that he had died, called my daughter. I was crying on the phone. And during that time, that about 20 minutes or so, I felt that I had killed him. I mean, the shame was on me. And fortunately, I think God was just kind of saying, "Oh gosh, Kim, here we go again. Let's not do this again." And he came back to life. It was after 20 minutes. I was on the phone with my daughter. The hospice nurse was at the door, knocking at the door, and I looked up, and he took this big, giant, deep breath, like like in the movies. It was just unreal. And my daughter was on the phone. I said, "He's alive!" And I dropped the phone and I ran over and got the hospice nurse. And we got him out of the tub. He was breathing. He wasn't conscious. And then, of course, I thought, with the shame, that shame thing, I thought, oh no, now I did some rescue breathing. Maybe now this is even worse because he's not dead, but he's alive, and he didn't want to, be in a hospital, be on a ventilator. He wanted to die just naturally. And now I've messed that up. These things go through your head. But fortunately, he did come to, and we had the most miraculous day. We brought the whole family over. He could say goodbye to everybody, even a brother that he hadn't talked to in about 10 years. Came over, and they reconciled, and we had this glorious, glorious day. It happened to have been my son Eric's birthday that day, so that made it even more glorious. And then the next morning, when he did finally die, the hospice nurse was there, and he had kind of was slipping off the bed, and so we, he didn't hurt himself. We kind of caught him, but I had to get people to get him up because I couldn't lift him. He was talking just like he was in the bathtub. He was talking, and then all of a sudden, as they lifted him up and they were putting him on the bed, he just stopped breathing again, very peacefully. And I realized that I just kind of, I'm a person of faith, so I attribute some of these things to God. And I just kind of felt God was saying, "Okay, Kim, now there's 3 people between you and him. You didn't do anything. His time is over. You just have to accept his time is up, and you didn't. It's not your fault." Mm-hmm. And the difference between how I felt when I thought that I had contributed to his death, and the second that just 24 hours later, by removing the shame or removing the guilt, there was such a difference in how I managed his death. Same death, but when you add shame, when you add guilt, you magnify that grief tremendously. So it's so important for people. And it's a false guilt. When someone takes their own lives, and I've been there myself, when someone takes their lives, it's not because of something you did. It is typically just they get to a point where life is so painful they can't see any other options. And so that grief and that pain and the shame and the guilt need to be recognized as for what they are, and they're not useful. And typically it's false. It's a false shame and false guilt.
Do you feel like those 2 emotions, guilt and shame, are sort of like the sneaky shadows of this grief pit that really keep people there?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you have to come to terms with yourself. And I talk a lot, about forgiveness and reconciliation. Well, you have to forgive yourself, and you have to reconcile with yourself. And that's such an important thing for you to be helpful to the people around you. And I'm focused kind of on legacy building now, and that's being helpful to the people around you. In order for you to do that, you have to forgive yourself. You have to come to terms with yourself. You have to be able to live with yourself and accept yourself for who you are. And realize that you are valuable. You are valuable no matter who you are, no matter what happened to you. You are a valuable human being. And some people just never get that understanding. And it's such a painful thing not to be there. And it took me a long time. I'm 67 years old. I probably figured that all out in my 40s, So I hope that some of you that are out there that are younger figure it out earlier, because it really would have saved a lot of pain. Part of it was my hand. I was different. There was a lot of things that, that it was very difficult on myself. And I have a friend who wrote a book, Speak Kindly, You're Listening. And I think one of the things she says is that you would never talk to other people the way you talk to yourself sometimes.
Sure.
If somebody else is struggling, you would never say, "Oh, you idiot, you did that." You'd never say that, but sometimes you say that to yourself. So you do need to speak kindly to yourself and stop that negative self-talk. It's so damaging, not only to you, but everybody around you, because everyone is affected by your demeanor.
Speaking of the sort of ripple effect of this, Elliot started touching on it. We do talk a lot about community. I'm curious about how in those earlier pits of grief, before you had this knowledge, the wisdom, the skill set that you have now, how you have leveraged your community just in the process of fighting your way out of the pit of grief.
I've been very fortunate in my life in that I've had supportive friends, and I have a large family.
Mhm.
And so I've had a lot of people around me that help me out of my pit, that have been there for me. I just yesterday was at a funeral for my niece, and her mother, who now lost her child, her only girl, and I lost my only boy. She was there the whole time. When Eric died, she was there. When my husband Jim died, was her brother. And her son, she had 3 sons, and one of her sons in particular has 3 boys. And they kind of filled in for us for the boys. You know, we lost our boy, right? And when we were yesterday, she was just hugging my daughter Hillary, and we kind of were joking, as we do, saying, well, okay, well, you kind of filled us in for us with the boy, and now you lost your only daughter, so now you've got 2 daughters here.
Mhm.
You know, and so I have people in my life that are able to surround me and love me and make me feel valuable and useful, even though I'm an old person. I'm an old person now. So sometimes we aren't considered valuable in our society, unfortunately. It's not like the sages in some other cultures, you know, but we're kind of like, you know, we're old now and we're gone. But I happen to have a family that loves me and, you know, tells me that they love me, and that gives me big hugs, you know, when I go to visit them. And the most important thing to tell someone if they're in that grief pit or they've had a problem is, I'm so glad you're here. I'm so glad to see you, and recognize that.
What do you say to the people that, you know, don't have the advantage of having a family or even having, you know, close friends?
Right. That, you know, I'm a person of faith. So for me, I'm never alone because God's always with me. But there are a lot of people that don't have that faith and are living without that. And I think that, first of all, if they're in that grief pit, understand that there is no shame in having an emotional illness. There's no shame at all in that, and that they need to get professional help. They need to get treated. That's out there. One of the other things I would really recommend is, if they don't have, is first of all to understand the importance of community and healing, and if they can, try to find a community of people that are like them. When my son died, I had a community of women who had all lost their sons to suicide. We formed our own little group. When I paint porcelain, we have a little group of porcelain painters. You know, so if there's a hobby that you like, or if there's something that you enjoy, try to find people that think like you, and work with other people. And if you can help other people, that's even better. With our group, the little group of the mamas after my son died, we were the first. There was a group of us that had lost our sons early, and then new members would come in. You know, we would find them. You know, we kind of find these people, and they'd come in, and we might spend, you know, a year listening to them cry or listening to them talk, because we would surround them, engage them, and understand that if you are able to get help, then one of the best ways you can feel better is to help other people.
Yeah.
It's amazing how that. I'll just give you just a quick example of what anybody can do. I try to get people to think in the form of legacy. Everything you do, every interaction, you are leaving a legacy. And that thinking like that has helped me quite a bit in just my life, because I'm a little spazzy person sometimes, you know. So I was in Chipotle the other day, and I was standing in line, and my daughter was going to pick me up in 5 minutes, so I had a limited time. And the woman in front of me was the customer from hell. I mean, she really was. She was an older woman. I think she had some sort of perhaps dementia or something. She had something going on. She was not acting as we would expect her to. And she was given this poor little 17-year-old kid the hardest time. She was, and he didn't know what to do. And he was trying, he'd put food down, then he'd take it off, then he'd put something else, he'd take it off. And he was trying to do whatever she asked, but he just couldn't make her happy. And all of a sudden, the line was getting really long. It was going back to the door. And he looked up at me for just a second. Now, I have to admit, at the moment, I was a little irritated, because it was past my 5 minutes. My daughter was waiting outside, and there was no end in sight to this woman being taken care of. But this young little guy back there, who was doing his best, looked up at me for just a second. And fortunately, because I think legacy instead of thinking me, I just gave him a big thumbs up and a big smile, like, you're doing good, you know. And then somebody came and waited on me, and a woman was still there. I mean, the poor guy. And I ran around, and when I paid for my food, I told the person at the counter, I said, you know, that young man is doing a fabulous job handling, you know, some difficulties. And so then he smiled, and he goes, oh yeah, I'm going to tell our boss about that, you know. So just that little, instead of going, oh gosh, you know, come on, hurry up, you know, I got to get going, which is kind of what my brain was feeling like doing. Because I've kind of tried to change. I'm not 100% accurate at this. I still mess up a lot. But because I'm able to think differently, I made a difference in that young man's life. I made a difference in the cashier's, and most importantly for me, I made a difference in my life because you get endorphins when you help somebody out and you smile or you help somebody. Those endorphins flood your head. If you're grumpy to somebody or you're mad at somebody, you stay mad, for a long time afterwards. So just trying to really understand that your interrelationship with everybody counts and try to keep it as positive as you can.
Yeah, I feel like already a theme kind of is emerging from what you're saying around making the decision. You're in the grief pit, you have to make the decision to fight. You're feeling the impatience of waiting in line. Make the decision to be helpful rather than spiteful or impatient. And those are things, it's sort of a theme that's come up in a variety of episodes for us around, okay, if I want to be happier in my life, if I want to be more satisfied in my life, if I want to grow and change and expand, I kind of have to make some decisions about how I respond to the world around me.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
And she's mostly talking about me, I think. and we talked about it in a previous episode, but in my opinion, I think that, whatever we'd like to call it, I would call it, the universe, it's a test. Like, standing in the grocery line, standing behind someone like that at Chipotle, that happens to me all the time. And I believe it's because I haven't overcome the ungratefulness that I seem to exude sometimes or oftentimes, or like just in the impatience that I have. And it's like the universe is saying, the reason that I'm putting you behind these lines so often is to test you to see if you can transcend yourself. And because you haven't, I'm going to keep testing you, and that keeps happening. And then you talk about leaving a little bit of a legacy. You have no idea what was happening in that 17-year-old's mind or the person you spoke to later behind the counter. And that one interaction could mean quite the difference. And I don't think we tend to really think about that very much because we're too wrapped up in ourselves. But if you're saying, if we have this lens of like helping other people in everything that we do, it kind of changes things quite a bit,
And it does help you out of the grief pit. Helping other people is one of the best ways you can get out of the grief pit. And I think that importance of reaching out is important. And I think over COVID, we kind of turned inward and we need to get out. When you stay in your own home, and you don't get out, you're not going to meet other people, and it sometimes can help keep you there.
Sure.
Going out, helping, taking part in society. That's what we're made for as humans. We're not meant to be alone.
I say that all the time. We're definitely not meant to be alone,
Right. Elliot and I were wondering about, we're kind of in a society where we shy away from death. So we experience we're terrified of getting old. We're terrified of losing people we love. But we're really inspired by how you speak about the people that you've lost so lovingly. And we were curious if you have kind of a rhythm or a practice or something that you do that helps you remember them or feel their presence on a regular basis.
I talk about my son. It's hard at first. I have to say, everybody's grief is different. So you're going to go through this roller coaster journey as you process it, and you're going to process it differently than everybody else. So during that time, don't judge yourself for anything, because I know that when Eric died, I didn't go into his room for 2 years. My husband would go in his room and sit there,
Wow.
and I couldn't hear his voice because he was quite a charismatic guy. There was a lot of videos of him, and he was really funny. Reminded me a lot of Robin Williams, which I think might, sometimes the funny, brilliant guys, have other issues. And so my husband would listen to those, but I couldn't hear it because it would just send me off the cliff. So we had to learn to adjust to each other and understand that we're going to be different. So he kind of said, if you're going to play that, just don't play it where I can hear it. We would just have to do that. But as we're going through that grief journey, it's so critical and important that we understand that we do have that control that you mentioned, that we can work, and we might fall down, like you're going to move up and then you're going to get a trigger of some sort, that tsunami's going to come and you're going to fall back down, you're going to move up. I tried to be a grief counselor after Eric died, and I lost my job a year later. So I didn't have a job and didn't have a son. My husband was sick and it was kind of a bad time. And so I decided, since I had time in my hands, I'd become a grief counselor. And I think I was helpful to the people that I was counseling, but I wasn't healed enough yet. So you have to understand where you are in that grief journey to determine what you can handle. I could do it now, But at the time, I was helping other people, but I would keep going down in the grief pit. When I heard their stories, I would take those on myself and go down. So you kind of have to balance all that out.
You were a grief counselor. Did you have a grief counselor for your?
Okay, no, because I'm a dentist, and we kind of think we can figure everything out. So that was wrong. I shouldn't have done that. But I just thought, well, I can, I have time now. I can figure this out. And so I became one because I needed one, but I didn't get one. Now I did have, I worked with my doctor through the depression. So I got through the depression part with help, but I didn't see a grief counselor, which was a big mistake. I should have. And maybe if I had seen a grief counselor, by the time I became a grief counselor, I could have been a grief counselor because my grief would have been a little further along. But no, I did not. And that was a mistake.
I have a friend who recently lost her dad in the last 3 years. And she likes to say that her dad comes to her as a hummingbird. So every time she sees a hummingbird, she just takes a moment, stops what she's doing, and is present with the hummingbird and thinks about her dad and sort of revels in the memory of him. And so things like that, I think, are things that we worry about. Is thinking about this person going to be the tsunami that triggers me and sends me back into the grief pit? But I really hear you saying it's not a journey that you can take alone. And if you choose to take it alone, it might be a lot longer.
Yes.
So leveraging the people that love you, whether it's family, whether it's friends, finding a community of people who may have experienced something similar, or getting a grief counselor. I think that's, it sounds so trivial, see a therapist, get a counselor, but it's so critical and so kind of underrated how helpful and important these people play in your journey.
Right. And what I try to do is keep, you mentioned before, and I don't think I answered that, but I do try to keep my son and my husband alive in the lives of my family. We talk about them all the time. When I give Christmas gifts, the gifts are from Nana and Angel Pop Pop. I call them, for the kids were little, grandkids were little, so we call them Angel Pop Pop. So we talk about them all the time. We have songs that remind us of them, and we play those. So we do keep them alive, and we talk about them. And when someone is going through grief, one of the best things you can do is tell a wonderful story about the one they lost.
Yeah, definitely.
We have some listener questions for you, Kim. Before we dive into them, we'd love to talk a little bit about the drink that we've given you. So this episode is sponsored by New Mexico Tea Company, and we're working on a custom Something More Human blend.
That's pretty great. And Kim approves. So that's nice.
Absolutely.
And this, I want to, take a second to say that it would have been a good segue when we were talking about COVID and talking about getting out and finding things that you love and immersing yourself in that to find your community. You're like, well, how does tea relate? And so I think it relates quite a bit. I mean, I think it brings people together, first of all, truly. And it's something that we're actually going to be doing later on this month. We're actually going to have a tea release party for the tea. And it's going to be another phone-free sort of experience, get together. And I think that's one of the ways that we like to cultivate our community, is to minimize distractions and to enjoy conversations like this, over some yummy tea. So
you're talking about how it brings people together. We're creating a bit of a barrier for ourselves by only accepting in-person interviews. So not only are we super grateful that you came all the way from Minneapolis,
truly,
but we also had a chance to chat with you this morning over tea. You had a tea, I had a coffee, Elliot had a latte, and I don't think we would have had the chance to do that if we did it all virtual. So thinking about the ways that other things connect us, it doesn't always have to be a book club or a widows group, but it can be something as simple as sharing a meal or bonding over a drink.
Yeah.
So we're really grateful to have this blend made, and it'll be available for purchase really, really soon.
And it's delicious. My favorite is Earl Grey, and it's just got a very unique and lovely, kind of a lovely flavor. It was delicious.
Yay, we're so glad you like it. Because if you didn't like it, this would be really awkward.
That's right. I wouldn't say I liked it. Just don't ask me.
That's funny.
I love that. Do you want to take over some listener questions that we collected?
Yeah, we do have some listener questions posted on Instagram a few days ago, asking people if they gave them a little bit of your background, not too much to spoil the interview, but definitely told our audience that the person that we're about to interview has dealt with a lot of loss in their life, and everyone's going to experience that one way or another. Whether it doesn't have to be an actual loss of a loved one, it could be a loss of a relationship, But I think this is a great time to ask people if they've got questions for someone like you. So the first one is, how do you support a friend who is experiencing grief? And the little bit of background is, I have a friend that recently lost her mother. And while I want to be there for her, I recognize that grief isn't linear and want to be mindful about bringing it up when she's having a good day or pretending things are fine when she might need me.
When you're working with someone that is going through a loss, the most important thing you can do is to realize that standing beside them, just being there, is one of the best things you can do. You're not going to fix it. I know that for years I try to find ways to fix their loss or make them feel better. You're not going to fix it. And sometimes platitudes will come out because we don't know what to do, right? And I remember when Eric died, a couple of people would say things like, God is only going to give you what you can manage. And I was like, well, then make me weak, or this is a suicide. Obviously, Eric couldn't manage, so there's sometimes people say things that might trigger, not because they intend to do that, but because they don't know what to say. Right. So the best thing is just come alongside, take them out to have tea, take them out to dinner, come over and watch a movie, just be there for them and help them with things that they need to do in their everyday lives. Because when you're in that grief pit, sometimes it's hard to manage taking care of children. If they have children, maybe come over and take their kids out and give them some time, or clean their house. Cleaning the house is probably one of the best things you could possibly do for someone when they suffer a loss, because they're probably going to have people come over, and so coming in and just helping get things organized, because your brain is in that fog. That grief fog is real. Mow their lawn, if it's do some little chores that are helpful. Pick people up from the airport for the funeral. All of those things are really helpful, but just showing up, being there, helping them with the cards, after the funeral, those things, those are so helpful. And then remaining with them as the weeks go by, because typically when you go through that, you're going through a shock, and that first week you're still in shock, and you really don't know what you're doing, but you're trying to plan a funeral, and there are people around, and you're kept busy. And then as each week goes by, the people kind of start to disappear. And so you just need to maybe even weekly or monthly get together, have something that's put on the schedule, put it on the calendar. We're going to see you on Tuesday, get them out of the house, get them out where they can be distracted. Those are some of the most important things that you can do. And also realize that one of the things that's very common for people that suffer a loss is you go out into the world and your mind is like, my world is over, everything's ruined. And then they see everyone else like living their normal life. They're laughing and they're joking and they're living their normal life. Just be aware that can be triggering too. Just like to be aware that they're going through some crazy head trauma in their head, because it's a traumatic experience in your head, in your brain. So just be there and help them, and don't expect them to think.
Yeah, that's great. We appreciate that. The next one is, what is one question you wish more people asked you about your journey?
Oh, that's a good one. I hadn't thought about that one before. I think that for me, honoring my husband and my son by asking, or by even, maybe not even asking questions, but telling of an experience that they had. Like, I remember one of Eric's coaches came up, and when he was in Little League, he came up and mentioned a time that was just a funny time with Eric. Oh, I remember when he did that. I remember when that happened. And, Jim used to always make me laugh. Those things are really helpful. I think one of the best things you can do when you see somebody that's just suffered a traumatic loss is to acknowledge their presence by saying, oh, I'm so glad you're here. Oh, thank you for coming. It's so good to see you. Those are sometimes the first things that are good to say, just acknowledging that. And then maybe, I'm so sorry, for your loss, but acknowledging that they're there. I might have to come back to that, because I can't think of a question that somebody would that I wish someone had asked me right now, but those things hopefully are helpful.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, definitely. And this last one is, if you could speak to a younger self after your major loss, what would you say?
I would say, you kick your butt to get out of that grief pit now, and don't allow yourself to get sucked in, because I did. There were years after my mother died where I was in that pit, and I felt I was helpless. And it's interesting because we all know the Kubler-Ross stages of grief. But when I was studying to be a grief counselor, I found out that there's another set, 4 tasks of mourning. And they are you accept the loss, which is a hard thing to do. And then after you accept the loss, then you have to process the grief, which is the hard part.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have to adjust to the new world. And the final outcome is that you maintain the person that you love somewhere, on your shoulder, in your heart. But you can live your life without that shroud that hangs over.
Mm-hmm.
And I love the task of mourning better than the stages of grief, because stages of grief sound passive. It's like you're going to go through these stages, like there's nothing you can do about it, right?
Sure.
But tasks of mourning, I love that idea because it's an action step, and getting out of the grief pit takes action. I believe that. So I think I would have told myself to get my rear in gear and get out of that pit and fight my way out and not allow myself to stay there as long as I did.
Yeah, that's great.
Mm-hmm. We're really in kind of a society where we shy away from grief. And I know that you talk about that a lot. Your latest book is all about leaving a legacy. So really thinking from the perspective of your own legacy, preparing for your own death. I'm curious from the perspective, Elliot and I both still have our parents.
Yes.
From the perspective of the children or of kind of younger people with older people that may be closer to end of life. How can we start these conversations about legacy or about their inevitable passing?
Yes. Well, I wrote the book. It's called Are You Ready? How to Leave a Legacy to Die For. That was one of my main reasons for writing it, because I think we need to have a conversation starter.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the first things you can do is allow them to understand what your expectations are after they die. For instance, your generation typically does not want all of our stuff. And it's very hard for us to come to terms with that. It's perfectly fine, but it's very hard for us to come to terms with that. And I've had to come to terms with that because my daughter and son-in-law told me that neither Jim nor I could die until this big shed was cleared out. And of course, my husband didn't listen to them and it left it with me. But that was a good conversation, because it's kind of like, we as a generation need to clean up our mess before we go.
Mm-hmm.
And one of my goals is to help my generation prepare for their death in a way that gives a soft landing for your generation.
Sure.
So that you can manage the grief. And you're not, and you know where everything is. I recommend putting everything. There's a workbook in the back about all the stuff you need to go into a 3-ring binder. I have all mine in a 3-ring binder. So I have my title of my car and all, my birth certificate and all that stuff is right in there. So it's a one-stop shop. When I go, they get the binder, they open it up, everything's there. They don't have to search through all my drawers trying to find, the life insurance policy, which who knows where that might be. It's all there. So my generation needs to take the time to prepare your generation for the transition.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an act of love. And that's what I'm trying to portray it to my generation, is that, this is one way to show your love to the next generation.
Mm-hmm.
And it's I don't want to judge anyone, because really it requires understanding that, okay, we are going to die, which is a truth. I mean, nobody's gotten out of it yet. We know that's inevitable,
right?
But it's hard to come to terms with. It's also hard to do the necessary downsizing because we are attached to our stuff. So it takes some time to do that. And also it's important that you have that discussion about death with your parent or grandparent from your side and from their perspective, because ultimately my goal and our goal as a generation should be to make things as easy for your generation as possible, which means writing a will so you're not going to fight over, with the, so you decrease conflict by having a real clear, very clear will established. Make sure you have a healthcare directive. That was so critical. When my husband died, he had a healthcare directive that says, I definitely do not want to go to a hospital. I want to die at home. And I mentioned before the grief, the shame that I suffered and guilt when he died, he didn't die exactly as I had expected. And so I took blame for it, right? But imagine if he hadn't written that down, because, should I take him to the hospital? Should I take him, he wanted to be in hospice.
Right.
Another reason for that is that many times if you don't have it written yourself, then different members of the family might have different ideas about how they want you to go. And it's so critical you decide if you want hospice or you want hospital, and make it yourself, because families have been torn apart because some people say, well, you sent grandma into hospice and killed her. I mean, but those discussions need to be had before you die.
Right.
Yeah.
Or before you're diagnosed with a terminal illness, when it gets to be a little stickier.
Right. I think, as much as there is a responsibility, like you're saying, for you to prepare our generation, I think there's a lot of responsibility that sort of we're not taking on in preparing ourselves, but also preparing our family members for when they pass. And what I mean by that is, what I hear a lot is, you said it earlier, actually, in this society, we seem to like throw older folks to the wayside when they have the most experience and knowledge, twice as much, 3 times as much as we do. And I think that one thing that a lot of older folks I've heard are looking for is for us younger folks to just ask them questions.
Yes.
I think that there's a lot of questions that I've missed out on asking my parents that I luckily still have the chance to do, but like, how much longer will I have that chance? And I think it's just something that we talked about when we were coming up with, when we were doing research and coming up with questions. Like, there's so many things that our parents are supposed to do for us, but like, what can we do for our parents? How can we make sure that when they pass, we aren't left with this unavoidable grief? Yeah, so I think that there's some things that we can do, and I hope that this episode will encourage people my age and Sam's age to think about that. How many more years do my family members have left, and what are the things that I can ask them? So I think that's really important, and I think that we have as much responsibility as you do, and we shouldn't shy away from that.
One of the things we have in the book is the last third is a workbook, and we have questions, legacy questions there, so that, and I'm encouraging people my age, but you certainly could do it with your mothers and fathers, is to just take your phone and ask them the questions like, well, where were you born? What was your childhood like? We found out that my mother-in-law was on the plains of Saskatchewan riding around in a sleigh to get to school with hot potatoes in her pocket to keep her hands warm. These are the kind of stories, right, that you'll never learn. When we die, if we don't share the information, it's gone.
Right.
Exactly.
So there's a lot of questions that you can ask them. One of the things I also recommend is, I call it the Grateful But Not Yet Dead Tour, is to go around to people that were important in your lives and thank them for that. Even as a young person, you can do that. Make sure if you see aging relatives, around the country that maybe were wonderful to you when you were a kid, to go and talk with them. It's amazing what it does for you too. That joy that you have discussing what your childhood and what they did, the impact they made on your lives, and how wonderful it is for them to hear it, to know that you're grateful. You talked about gratitude.
Right.
That's another thing you can do. And talk about the expectations, kind of where mom and dad, where is everything? Where do we need to know? Let them know that you're thinking about it. There's also a book called Being Mortal by Atul Gawande that is fabulous for just discussing this time of life. One of the things that you might help them with, and I just had that happen over the weekend with, I had a funeral for my niece who passed away at 56. And before she passed away, she had terminal cancer, and she knew she had terminal cancer. Before she passed away, she made sure that her parents were out of their big house with all the stairs and all the stuff. They had to get rid of their stuff, and they moved them into a manageable little condo that they can, 1 floor, and they can stay in for a very long time. And she made sure that she did that before she died. And I thought that was just a wonderful thing to look out for her parents before she died. So just help them with that transition, and understand that we are a different generation. We have emotional attachments to our stuff. Getting rid of our stuff is hard. Sometimes if you say, mom and dad, you just need to get rid of your stuff, they might take it the wrong way and feel like, well, no, that's my stuff. But work with them very gently. Understand they're attached. Understand they might be offended if you kind of tell them, like, my daughter was blunt. You can't die until that's cleaned out. But you don't necessarily. We took it because of our relationship. But your relationship with your parents, what you can say, what you can't say. Understand they're emotionally attached to their stuff, and sometimes their stuff is preventing them from moving forward because they have a house full of stuff. And they might want to move to a smaller place, but they don't know how they're going to get rid of their stuff.
Right.
I have friends that took a year, more than a year, to clean out their mother's house. And it was a huge job. It's a hard job. So help your parents along the way to get into that position, but be very gentle.
That's good advice, definitely.
I'm all about tangible tips and strategies. So a couple that I'm hearing are, in terms of legacy, being very intentional about communicating where your heart is. So although it might sound like these conversations could be coming from a selfish perspective, like, hey, you can't die with all this stuff that you're going to give me. But letting them know that it is an act of love to prepare us for their inevitable passing, and that you want to be a part of the process and a part of the conversation. A few others that I'm hearing about dealing with grief is decision making is really important, and the pit of grief is really normal. Guilt and shame are really normal, but in order to get out of it, there must be a decision to fight it, to do the kicking and the screaming and start the journey out, and you can't do it alone. So finding a community, finding a group, finding a counselor, surrounding yourself with people you love, and when you're the support person, just being there. You can relieve the pressure of saying the right thing or making them feel better, because you can't take someone's grief away. Are there other tangible tips and strategies that I may have missed?
I think when I'm hearing it's a resounding theme is selflessness. You know, it's understandable, and it's normal to be caught up in our own worlds. I mean, that's kind of the only world that we can really perceive, you know, but we don't realize that being selfless will actually just help us in the long run, even if it's an extrinsic reason, you know, even if we're inherently selfish, acting selfless will sort of help us move through the grief and feel better about those relationships. You know what I mean? I feel like that's sort of the theme that just keeps coming back to me is if you can do something for someone else, you should do it. You know, that'll help you, and that'll take you a long way. It's hard to do. I mean, it's hard to put into practice because, like I said, we are so wrapped up, especially in such an individualistic culture, you know? And I think the more that we focus on the togetherness and the community, the better chance we have at being selfless by nature, you know?
And going out and finding those communities. I work with a lot of widows, and many times they're caught up in the grief. They're alone for the first time, and they feel kind of paralyzed in their situation. And one of the best things for them is to get out and get involved in different groups or finding hobbies. I think finding some sort of a hobby or something that you enjoy doing that might help you later on is just always a good thing.
Absolutely. Sam and I want to thank you so much for listening to Something More Human. If you're enjoying the podcast and want to support us, there are plenty of no-cost, minimal effort ways you can do so.
For starters, you can subscribe to the show on your favorite listening platform. You can leave us a 5-star review, drop us a comment with a topic you'd like to hear us discuss in an upcoming episode, and you can also keep up with us on Instagram and TikTok. Give us a follow there at Something More Human. Thanks so much.
Thank you.